Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 181 of the podcast. In this episode, I get to talk with Jenny Funderburke Smith all about gospel-centered kids ministry and some discipline tools when it comes to leading kids and leading volunteers to help them. Our volunteer team actually had a conversation about this just yesterday. So having this episode now is helpful because we talk about some practical tools, but more of the conversation is around this gospel-centered kids ministry idea. Now, before we jump in, I want to remind you that we have about maybe 10, 11 days left where you can become a member with Ministry Boost and get access to all of our on-demand courses, something like 25 plus courses for just $20 a month a person. If you have multiple staff, it's actually even cheaper than that per person, and it'll never be that price again. So that this will be open until March 6th, Friday, when I'm recording. That's next Friday, next week, so a week from this Friday. And it'll never be that cheap again. It'll be $30 a month after that, and it might even go up from there because it's access to all of our on-demand courses with all of our instructors, everything from, new to KidMin or YouthMin or Next Gen to aligning your Next Gen team or elementary large group or implementing small groups in preschool. Lots of practical things like leading staff. So maybe it's not even in, the kids, student, family ministry world only. It could be about leading staff or recruiting volunteers with the volunteer playbook, onboarding volunteers, lots of courses and content. That's probably my favorite part, is that there's content and downloads and resources in there that you can use in your ministry. And you can sign up to become a member for just $20 a month for 6-month minimum commitment. And that expires, though. That's going to close March 6th. And then the other thing we're excited about is that mastermind groups are back. So the mastermind groups are just online coaching groups. You meet every other week via Zoom video call for 1 hour. And we'll have different groups. We're launching some next-gen groups with me, Kenny Conley, Kevin Monahan, leading those. And then we're going to have some children's ministry groups with Kelly Stockdale, Gina McLean, and Lisa Malidi. And then we're also, and I'm really excited about this, going to have a preteen ministry group, mastermind group, with Lisa Malidi and Bill Hegedus. And then we have a youth ministry group with Will Hutcherson. And so those are some mastermind groups that are going to be launching late March, early April. They'll meet every other week for 5 months, and you can be a part of that. If you're a member, then you save on the cost of a mastermind group. Actually, now with this founding member launch, where it's just $20 a month, it's actually cheaper to be a member and do the mastermind group than it is to do the mastermind group by itself, which won't always be the case, of course. But with the founding member price, that's how it works out. So you can check that and more out at ministryboost.org. There's the course, the membership, and then there's the coaching. And all of that is open right now for registration. So you can get the notes for this episode at nickblevins.com/episode 181. But let's go ahead now and jump into my conversation with Jenny about gospel-centered kids ministry and discipline tools when it comes to leading kids. Today I'm talking with Jenny Funderburke Smith. Welcome to the podcast, Jenny.
Hey, Nick. Thank you so much for having me.
You bet. Thanks for coming on the podcast. As we get rolling, tell us a little bit about you, your family, and your church.
Sure, absolutely. So I live in warm and sunny Bradenton, Florida, which is much warmer, even though I'm freezing right now. It's much warmer than where you are, I think.
Freezing is not 60 degrees.
Freezing.
There's a definition for freezing, and it's not 60 degrees.
Well, when you live in Southwest Florida, 60 degrees is freezing.
Just rub it in.
I totally am. Totally am. That's okay. So I'm married to Dan, and I have 3 girls. Kaylee is 14 and in 8th grade. Brenna is 12 and in 6th grade. And then Hallie Joy, the baby, is 6 and in 1st grade. So lots of girls, lots of drama, and lots of words in our house.
That's great.
And I've been at West Bradenton Baptist Church for the past 7.5 years. It'll be 8 years this summer. We are an established church, so a church that's been around for a long time and have been working in the past several years on a little bit of revitalization there of helping get new families in, young families in, and great place, great people, and just, trying to see what God has for us in the future. So it's been a great adventure the past 8 years, even when it's cold in January, but it's 80 degrees the rest of the year, right?
Even when it's cold in January. Yeah, whatever. So we're going to talk about a couple different topics, but the umbrella of it will be gospel-centered kids ministry. And that sounds obvious as to what that is, but how would you describe it if somebody said why that? Like when you use that term, what do you mean? What are you getting at?
Sure. So I think the easiest way for me to explain it is there are lots of things in kids ministry that we can focus on, and there are so many elements to kids ministry, from games to check-in to different curriculum choices to so many facets of children's ministry, that sometimes the main focus of what we're supposed to be doing gets lost. And we can become very focused on bringing more kids in, which is great. Outreach absolutely is great. We can be more focused. We become focused on having the most kids in the room. We can be focused on entertaining kids and making them happy, which is all super, super important. But we lose that main focus, and that's being centered on the gospel of Jesus. And what I mean, I don't want to take for granted that anybody knows. I taught on this in my own church not too long ago about how we were going to be gospel-centered, get through the whole thing. And at the end, one of my very best volunteers raised their hand and says, "So can you clarify what you mean by gospel?" I was like, oh, maybe I should have done that first, right? Just like you said, the things that we assume we're all on the same page. And just the very essential of that is the gospel is the good news of what Jesus has done for us, right? That God rules. He is the king of the whole world. He created people who sin and mess up and are separated from him, and that he sent Jesus to pay the price for our sins, to be the sacrifice for our sins so that we could be reconciled to him. Jesus died on the cross, rose from the dead, and made a way for us to be able to repent and to be able to go to heaven. So the simple truth that we all know, but that what I believe to be a gospel-centered children's ministry is that's got to be the root and the core of everything that we do. And so that really does impact everything that we do. And as we're focused on the gospel, we don't stop doing all the other things. So that doesn't mean we stop being fun and we stop trying to make it the best environment we can do and all that. It just means that we don't lose that focus because of those other things.
Sure. And I'm sure a lot of people think about curriculum, and we can certainly talk that, but I'm thinking like, I do want to talk volunteers, so I'll come back to that later, making sure they get it. But if we just start with like what we control first, what is happening during the week, the curriculum, the content, what does that look like? Like, how does someone know I'm prioritizing this in this week, when I'm preparing for this Sunday?
Sure. I think whatever curriculum you use, and there's great ones out there, but everyone we have the responsibility of looking at and making sure we know really what we're teaching our kids. And I think it's just really looking at it and evaluating what's the takeaway my kid is leaving with, or the kids are leaving with. When they hear this lesson, are they leaving with, I'm a good person? Or are they leaving with, if I try really hard, that will make God happy? That's not gospel-centered. Whatever we're teaching, we need to make sure that we're getting to the point of, Jesus loves you. Jesus died for you. Yes, you're a sinner, but God sent his only son to forgive you of that, that you are, you created by him, that we're focusing on gospel-centered truth. We're teaching them to be all the good things that the Bible tells them to do as well, right? But it's all rooted in who Jesus is and what he's done for us, not in just be a good little boy or a good little girl. That the stories we teach, that it's not kids aren't the hero because they're trying to be good. Even the Bible characters weren't heroes. God was the hero in these stories. And that we're focused on those truths, whatever curriculum that we teach. And that the gospel, sharing what Jesus has done for us, is not just for Easter. I think we fall into that trap a lot too, is that we talk about the cross at Easter and at VBS when we do our salvation presentation. But our kids need to hear all the time about the truth of what Jesus has done for us.
Yeah, I think about like when I grew up in our church, there was an invitation every week, and that was very popular. I think a lot of churches did that in multiple different denominations and streams. And then there's sort of like a swing the other way, in a sense, in some churches where the gospel is certainly shared, or even some churches might celebrate communion every week. Our church does that. So there's some measure of it that way, but it's not the same, as an invitation every week. And there's churches that now, they do both. There's some that do it every week, some not. I was at a church recently with a friend where we're touring the rooms, and the kids' rooms, and there's like these 3 lights above the door, yellow, red, green, or red. I guess it was red, yellow, green, because red meant the service the idea was to tell you when the service was about to end.
Okay.
And red meant, it's just the service is in progress, like just proceed as normal. Yellow meant it's near the end. They're doing the gospel presentation and offering. And I was like, oh, so every single week, like you can't miss a week. I mean, I guess you could, and you just turn on the yellow light for something else, but like that's your key. And you do it the same, everything's in the same order. You know what I mean? I was a little surprised by that. And he said, yeah. And then green, of course, means the service is over. Here they come, get ready. And then there are churches that don't, present that as much. So, but my question to you is, with kids ministry, would your goal be, every week it's in there somehow, whatever they're learning in the Bible, we're presenting that with kids? Because I do know churches where it's every week invitation in the service, but not every week spoken about in children's ministry. What would you say to that?
No, my argument would be every week. Y'all, this is the main thing, right? What Jesus has done for us and helping kids understand that is the main thing. And here's the deal too, Nick, is the gospel isn't just you get saved and that's it, right? The gospel, what Jesus has done for us, affects our whole spiritual life and our whole spiritual walk. So I think a lot of times what we communicate to kids, when I grew up, I didn't grow up in church, started going to church in middle school, high school. And I understood that Jesus died for me, and for me to be saved and go to heaven, I needed to trust in him. But what I heard from there on out was, now don't do this, don't do that. It was all rules-based from there. Instead of understanding that Jesus' grace, that I respond with that kind of behavior out of a love and understanding of the grace that he's given me, right? And so I think it's our responsibility every week to help kids understand and hear about the grace of Jesus, to offer that opportunity for salvation, but also help them understand that the gospel affects every part of their life from here on out. It's not just pray this prayer and be done. It's learning and growing in that grace and learning to be more like him because of that grace. And so, yes, I absolutely believe that element. Our default as grownups, even much less kids, is to move away from that idea of grace and move towards, I got to do a checklist of do's and don'ts. And that's not what the gospel is. And so I think we've got to help kids every lesson see how this relates to what Jesus has done for them.
Now, you would add that. So you'd write that in, like if your curriculum didn't use it. Obviously, it's a huge factor as you're picking curriculum too. But for those that are listening that, maybe that's not something that's in every week, you're saying, write that in somehow. Yeah,
just include it somewhere, somehow. And there's a great book called Gospel-Centered Children's Ministry, and it's by Brian, and I always mess up his last name. You can probably say it right. Dembowswick. I can't say it correctly. I don't know if I can say it right either.
Sounds good.
But if you look up Gospel-Centered Children, he really does a great job of talking about how to take every scripture, every Bible story, and help point it back to Christ. And I think about the story in the New Testament after Jesus rose from the dead, and he's walking with the disciples down the path, and they don't know it's him yet. And he starts explaining to them how every part of the Old Testament was pointing back to him, right? And so he sets that example of that's not a crazy thing to do, that as we're teaching these stories of David and Goliath, let's not tell the kids, you are David and you can be really brave. Jesus is the hero, not David, not us, but Jesus is the hero. And Brian's book does a great job of helping realize how to do that. But yeah, I don't think it can just be special events. I think the gospel definitely needs to be the center of our teaching and of what our kids are experiencing.
Let me ask you this. I didn't even think about this till we were just talking about it right now. But this is down in the weeds kind of detail. I've heard some folks, and curriculums are all over the map with this, right? There's extremes one way or the other. There's lots in the middle. And it's funny, and you probably hear this too. It's always funny to hear people complain about certain parts of curriculum, and then you can go point to the other one that's the opposite, that's too far. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, oh, that went too far the other way. Like I always joke, sometimes there's room in the middle, for both. And actually, I've seen a lot of curriculums even come what I would call more towards the middle, from their extremes. But one thing I have heard before is with a curriculum that's wanting to be gospel centered and tie everything back to Jesus, sometimes it's odd, I guess is the only way to say it. They're like, this is a little bit odd to talk about this. And I don't want to, the example I'm thinking of is not in a curriculum, but how the covering of Adam and Eve is like Jesus when they were, not naked, they were covered. Sure. Yeah. And that represents Jesus covering us, like that kind of thing. And I don't remember the examples they gave me and just how it'd be hard. Like, man, that was hard to teach, 6-year-olds. For you, like, what does it look like? I mean, if it's in the curriculum, you got to start with it. But if you're like writing it in, are you trying to get super detailed exegetical, like that level, connect back to Jesus? Or are you taking it higher up? Like, no, this is just part of one big story, one overarching story. How does that work?
Yeah, I think, obviously it depends on your age group, right? So you may get a little more detailed with fifth graders because they think they know it all anyway. So some of those more intricate details like that, they might be interested in. But for most kids, just higher level, that it is part of a bigger story, that God has sent a rescuer, God is the hero. Every story you can see elements of sin, especially in the Old Testament, right? We see elements of sin that people need to be rescued from. Most stories that we share with kids have a hero or have a rescuer. And you can do much higher level. Like, you don't have to get into the Adam and Eve coverings and all of that kind of stuff. I don't think that's where we necessarily need to go.
Sure.
But just the bigger picture, that God is in charge of everything, that people mess up, that we needed a rescuer for our sin, and that God promised a rescuer, and that God's the hero in that. I think going higher level like that is absolutely fine.
Well, tell us about gospelatcenter.com, a website you and some friends started, and like, what's the focus of that?
Sure. So the focus of that is, several of us have been in kids ministry world for a really long time. And we had the conviction that when you Google, I may have said this earlier, when you Google kids ministry, you'll find a lot of games and a lot of fun and maybe not as much Jesus. And so we had a concern for that, for the kids ministry community as a whole. And so our focus was, let's be a voice for encouraging children's ministers and those that are serving kids and families to just reevaluate and refocus on what is the very most important. Because there's a lot of, when you go to these conferences or you look at resources, there's a lot of pressure to do a lot of things. And we, in children's ministry community, we have a lot of people that are just starting out or have just kind of gotten thrown in. They got voluntold that this is what they're going to be doing from now on, or they're in smaller churches that don't have all these resources, and they're just kind of out there searching for, what am I even supposed to be doing? And so we wanted to be a voice to say what we need to be doing is focusing in on the gospel and focusing kids. The very most important thing we can do is help them understand the truth of Scripture and understand what Jesus has done for them. And so that's what we've done. We provide some content. We're all busy, like full-time jobs, just like you, and trying to figure out how to provide the content that people need, but just some encouragement and some ideas and some resources to help focus your ministry on the gospel.
Yeah, and I like that you have some of the like principles and the theory's not the right word, but the why. Yeah. But then you also have some practical ideas, like it says ideas, and you have posts there about anything, clarifying the gospel or something this Christmas or that kind of thing, which is good too, because I could see that's people need both. You know what I mean? Right. Tell me the why, right. Especially as we're going to talk about in a second with volunteers. But then they also need the practical, like what do I do this weekend? Sure. That's good.
Sure.
That's awesome. So you talked about training volunteers. What do you think it takes to get this mindset and this whole attitude and this approach into volunteers? Because just like the example you gave, it can get lost in the translation there. So how do leaders do that?
It is a continual conversation and is a continual understanding. I've had this in my heart for years, and it's still a constant learning and understanding and seeking Scripture and asking God to help make it more clear to me. And so that's what I have to understand with my volunteers is giving them curriculum, giving them tools that make it easy, but also giving them resources to help them learn and grow themselves. And my favorite story, Nick, was I have this sweet, sweet lady. I don't even know how old she is, probably 70, but she's been teaching first grade for 30 years at my church, right? And so there are people my age that had her, but she's absolutely phenomenal. And so she will read anything I give her. She will pay attention. She'll come to every training. She's all in. But she told me, we went to lunch a few weeks ago, and she said, I read that gospel-centered book, and it finally made sense to me. She said, I understand why we're teaching these kids all of these things. And it was like she all of a sudden had that aha moment. So that's why I say it's a continual conversation, is continual trainings. We do 5-minute meetings. I think you guys call them huddles. We do 5-minute meetings before our services, and just a constant reminder of here's what we're teaching today. Here's how that ties into what Jesus has done for us. Here's why our kids need to know that. And just, I guess that's my best answer is continual conversations, continual resources for them, helping them learn and grow and be discipled as well.
Yeah. In the same way that you're like making sure it's a focus for kids in their content. You're making sure it's a focus with volunteers. That's
Absolutely.
good.
Absolutely. What you focus on is what's going to define your ministry, right?
Sure,
and so if we're focusing on fun, which is great, that's going to be the center of your ministry, and that's what your volunteers are going to focus on. If you focus on what the walls look like and the decor, and that's your main emphasis, then that's what everybody else is going to be focused on. And none of those are bad, but it's just a question of what are we most centered on, and that's what your volunteers are going to catch as well.
Mm-hmm. Now we're going to kind of transition, talk about a topic that fits in this umbrella, and that's discipline with kids, which is like not something I don't think most people get excited about in children's ministry. Like, yeah, I can't wait to figure that out, or, how to deal with the kid that's, not behaving well in class. But it's a in the weeds problem for leaders, for volunteers, because they do have to deal with this, and they do
Absolutely.
need help and tools. And so many of them have no idea, right? Like, it's not like they have experience as a teacher or something like that where they can bring that in. So, but you've done a couple breakouts on this. So talk to us a little bit about discipline in light of gospel-centered kids ministry.
Sure. And you are right. It's a universal problem, no matter, or universal issue that kids ministries deal with, whether you have 10 kids on a Sunday morning or you have 2,000 kids on a Sunday morning. One or two of those are going to be scraggly, and everybody's going to have to deal with it. And so this is probably one of the topics that I deal with the most and get the most questions about and have the most concerns about from other children's ministers, because just like you said, we have volunteers in the room who love Jesus, and they maybe know how to discipline their own kids, but they haven't really had the training to know how to discipline other kids as well. But it's so important, because in children's ministry, I think we tend to fall in one of two extremes. It's either anything goes because we don't want to make any kids mad and they don't want to come back to church, so we're not really going to set a whole lot of boundaries. Or you have those environments that are super strict, super old school. Teacher says you must immediately do, it just nobody moves. Everybody sits quietly in their chair for 30 minutes. And neither of those, I think, are good. I don't think either of those are representative of what God wants us to do, and definitely not how he treats us. So I think it's really important to remember that the root of the word discipline is disciple, that us providing structure and us providing management of behavior in classrooms, that's part of this discipleship process of these kids. And the Bible talks a lot about discipline. It talks about how God disciplines us. It talks about how parents should discipline their children. And all of those are in the context of love and of being life-giving. And so I think we would all agree that that's what we want that's the environment we want our children's ministries to be, right? We want them to be loving. We want them to be life-giving. And so part of that is figuring out boundaries for kids, figuring out how to manage those kind of behaviors. And I think that it's not hard. It's hard because kids are scraggly, and you can come up with every guideline and every perfect solution, and there's going to be somebody that comes in and breaks it. But there are things that we can do to make it more manageable. We can figure out consistent rules across our ministries. And our ministry, our three guidelines are show love for God, show love for others, and show love for yourself. And those are the things that we repeat in every single classroom. Those are things that every single teacher knows. Those are things that every kid knows. It just provides some boundaries and some guidelines. So when a kid's smacking another one in the face, we're able to say, hey, remember, this is a place where we show love for others, and that's not what you're doing right now. Another very practical thing that we can do is have consistent consequences throughout the ministry and let teachers know that. I think a lot of times our volunteers feel stuck because they don't know what they're allowed to do and what they're not when a kid's being a little bit nutty. And so helping them know, okay, first time, just have a verbal warning with them, talk with the child. Second time, remove them from the game or the activity. Third time, let's just take them out of the room, and what we do is use that as an opportunity for a gospel conversation, right? Sit down and talk with them about, so what were you doing? Why were you doing that? Why is that not okay? We all mess up, and here's how we need to move on from there. And so those are some big picture principles of what I try to teach and help kids ministers with is we basically just need to provide a structure for our volunteers that they know what's expected of kids and what they can do when those kids don't follow those things.
How do you teach? Yeah, I think that structure is the key, because I think that's part of what volunteers don't have. You mentioned the extremes earlier, that they're either like super disciplining or it's really loose and do whatever you want. And each volunteer probably has that same
Yes.
thing. And so then they just do whatever, their go-to is. How do you, how do you teach volunteers and kids what the structure is? Like, is it something volunteers is probably during onboarding? I imagine you're talking about it and bring it up later. With kids, what does that look like? Because it's not like you want every week to start with, okay, let's talk about the rules. You know what I mean? So like, how does that come up?
We kind of do, but in a more fun way. So with volunteers, like you said, in onboarding and then every year during training, we just go over those again. What do those expectations look like for the kids? And how do we use that as part of our language with the kids, right? By showing good examples, oh, I love how Nick is sitting and listening. He's really showing love for the people around him, and using it, reminding a kid privately, hey, this is not what we do. You're not really showing love for your friends when you're poking them with a pencil when we're supposed to be singing or whatever. So training them how to use that language. One of my big wake up calls too is that's got to be a continual conversation. So we had trained on it. I felt it was totally ingrained in our ministry. And then I just didn't talk about it for a while. And so a couple of years later, I had a sweet, sweet volunteer who's a teacher, a school teacher. And she sat me down and she said, here's what I really think we need. I think we need expectations for the kids, and we need consequences for the kids, and we need a plan ministry-wide. And I was like, oh, we do. I just forgot to tell you. And so I think it's really important that we remember to include that, like you said, in the onboarding, that we're continually training about it. And then with the kids, what I encourage our volunteers to do is take 20 seconds at the beginning of each week and say, hey, guys, just remember, here's the 3 things that we expect you to do this week. 20-second conversation. And that just sets the tone for the room and for the kids as a reminder. You got to remember, too, how many of our kids come once a month, twice a month, once a quarter, right?
Sure.
And so we can't assume that they're going to walk in and know what we expect of them. So yeah, just that brief 20-second, it's not like a harsh come to Jesus, let me slam down the hammer. It's just 20 seconds. Hey, real positive. Here's what we expect of you.
Yeah, well, 20 seconds of here's like what we're going for, the positive part, which is how yours is framed.
Yes.
It's very different than 20 seconds or 2 minutes of don't do this, don't do that. If you do that,
absolutely.
You're out. If you do this, you're, you know what I mean?
Yes.
So I like that because you're shaping the culture you want with the right words in a positive way.
Absolutely. And, it doesn't make sense to do if you try to just do 3 or 4 do's and don'ts, the kids are going to think of the 19 that you didn't think of, right? And so that's why we picked 3 that were broad, but just about anything could fit under, and also based on scripture. We pulled it from where Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment is, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And so that's where our 3 came from.
That's great. Well, I want to ask you about, and I know you've talked about this when you've done breakouts, trauma as it relates. And you had texted me some weeks ago and asked me if I knew Kim Botto.
Yes.
And, and she's been on this podcast talking about that. We should probably have her come back. And that's why you were asking, though, because she loves to talk about this and does a great job with this. But as it relates to discipline, you were saying before we started recording, it's just we all have this now, and it's just going to continue to grow. So what does that mean, and how do we factor that in and just be aware of that, and how does that change or not our approach?
Sure. So Kim teaches on trauma-informed care, and basically what that is a different way that what research has shown is a different way that we can interact and handle and disciple these kids who are coming from hard places. And what that means is foster care or adoption from a foreign country or other kind of trauma in their life, whether it's abuse or parents' divorce or neglect or fill in the blank. And what is always consistent when I teach on behavior is at the very end, when everybody's leaving, somebody will come up and say, all that was great and works with 98% of the kids, but I have that kid. And we all have that kid. And I've been in ministry 20 something years now, and there are a lot more of those kids, in quotes, right, than there used to be. And we're just in a different culture, and we're in a different day. And we're seeing that in our children's ministry. Even just the simple fact that our churches are rallying around foster care, which is amazing. And I'm so glad and grateful that we are doing that. That's exactly what we should be doing. But that brings in a different dynamic in children's ministries, because we're dealing with those kids from hard places. And what I absolutely love about the trauma-informed research, Nick, is that it's the gospel. Like when you read the books, when you read the research, when you read the literature about it, the bottom line is these kids need relationship, and these kids need grace and understanding. And if anybody in the planet should be doing that, it should be the children's ministries. Now, it's hard because these are not the kids that come in and sit in their assigned chair and color their paper and are quiet and smile at you all day, all Sunday morning. These kids are hard. And so I strongly encourage those in the children's ministry community to take a look at some of the research that's out there, take a look at some of the resources that are out there as far as trauma-informed care. Look up Kim Botto and her stuff, and maybe go back and listen to your podcast that you had her on, because I feel it's our responsibility to show Jesus' love to all these kids, even the ones that are really, really hard, and learn how to connect with them. Because Nick, our old school ways of, I'm the teacher, I say this, you got to do it, it just doesn't work with these kids that have been through trauma. And I feel it's our responsibility to learn how to connect with them so that we can share Jesus with them.
Is there, you mentioned, about volunteers trying to train them when there's onboarding and all that, and you learned that maybe you weren't talking about the gospel stuff enough. And as it relates to this, though, what has training looked like? How have you made sure that volunteers understand how to deal with this? Like, how regularly do you think, I guess is what I'm asking, you have to bring this up again with them? Or is it kind of like if they get trained well in onboarding, they just remember?
That's a great question. And honestly, we're new to it at our church. And so what I did is our beginning of the year big training, we focused on this issue. And I brought in someone that's connected with the foster care community in our area, who does the training on trauma-informed care for foster parents. Sorry, for some reason that was hard to say. And she just did a phenomenal job. And it was so great to me to watch, because we have teachers, like I mentioned, that have been teaching a really long time. And it's been a really hard thing for them to understand why these kids are coming into their room and are behaving how they want, and they're not responding to the typical authority way the typical authority they're used to having. And so just for them to be able to understand the brain research and the trauma research behind it, and just really kind of be able to have that aha moment of this is okay. This is how we can deal and handle these kids and show them Jesus. And it's okay, even though it's different from what I've had. So our intention is probably once a year to at least to have somebody in or to address the topic, and then to send out stuff periodically throughout the year as well. As far as onboarding, I think probably, it's just hard to cover everything when you're onboarding a new volunteer. I think definitely we can introduce the highlights of it. That'd be a great thing that they can learn as they're walking alongside other volunteers, is learn that training, and then we've got to do it regularly as well.
Yeah. Well, that's good. I know that is one of the most common practical questions, you get. We have a children's ministry network locally here, and when we get together, that's almost there's things you can think that they always want, volunteer recruiting, but this is at the top of the list too. Discipline and training their leaders and how to do that. That's good stuff. So before we wrap up, I do want to ask about the Revitalize Network, something that your pastor is a part of, and the Revitalize conference that you host. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so my pastor is Sam Rayner, and he and his dad, Tom Rayner, over this past year or so, began a nonprofit called Revitalize Network. And the passion behind that is the hundreds of thousands of churches in our country that are dying, right? That are down to 10, 15, 20 people that are really struggling and need a movement of God. We believe that mega churches, there are churches for everybody, right? God can use any size church, but there's a reason God has thousands of these churches in neighborhoods throughout our country. And we believe that quite possibly one of his next big movements will be to work through these churches that are already right beside people's houses. And so we believe that God can save any church. And so Revitalize Network exists to help pastors and help resource pastors to do what needs to be done to help their church move out of a dying stage and back into a growing stage. And so I'm really excited about what Revitalize Network does. I'm really excited about what Church Answers, that's another side of it, does. I'm really looking at how to help resource and equip children's ministers too, who are in these situations. A lot of these churches have volunteer children's ministers or people who are just trying to survive week to week. And we're really excited about what those opportunities look like, of how can we help and come alongside, and what can God do through all that. And so we are hosting the Revitalize 2020. which is a 2-day conference in April, and it will be at our church, West Bradenton. And we would love any of you that are listening that are in that situation, or your church is in a revitalized situation, we would love for you to come and be a part of that.
April 20th and 21st. It is in sunny Southwest Florida. So
the weather's going to be perfect. April is beautiful.
That's a plus. We talked about this before, and I did not think about this, but as you were talking about now, I remembered one time years ago, it's like 10 years ago at least, we had a guy working with our staff just to help with like our team and culture and chemistry and all that stuff. He'd worked with our pastor at another church, and I guess just for fun or something like that, he asked a question. His question was that we all had to answer, like, what would you do if, you had as much money as you needed to do it, and whatever you did would work? Like, like that dream scenario, like you wouldn't, have to worry about whether it's not even just, you get to try it. It actually would work. And people, it was, answers were all over. I mean, everything from like, I don't know, singing in a band to like playing sports or whatever. And, and at first, my answer was I would have an organization to help plant a bunch of churches. But then as I thought about it, I thought, no, because if it would definitely work, I would have an organization that would revitalize existing churches because they're already there. And I was just thinking about the math. Right. The math is like, well, there's just already so many. And if you're telling me it works no matter what, I'm going to pick that, like I'm cheating. And I didn't think about that before. But it makes sense. It's the same idea, I guess, that there's just so many churches, and we need new churches. I mean, I think we finally reached a point a few years ago where in the U.S. more churches are starting than are dying, but barely. Like 3,000 or 4,000 die every year, and something like 3,000 or 4,000 start every year. But there's this whole other group, so that's a really good thing, and it's going to help a lot of churches. There's a friend of mine too that is connected to some other similar type of thing, and there just needs to be a lot of that restoring churches and helping them out. So that's good. And you can't beat South Florida.
Right? Come on.
For sure. So how can leaders connect with you, social media, website, stuff like that?
Yeah. So my personal blog is at jennyfunderburke.com. And then, sorry, that keeps beeping. And then you can also check out gospelatcenter.com. And then my Twitter is Jenny_F_Smith. And I would love to connect with anybody. It's one of my favorite things is connecting with people who are in the trenches in children's ministry and talk about the hard things. So I would love to connect with anybody in your audience. That'd be great.
Awesome. Well, Jenny, thanks for coming on the podcast and for doing what you do. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Nick. I appreciate you. Thanks for being such a great voice in our community.
Well, I love talking with Jenny. I mean, she's just one of the most genuine, kind-hearted, loving people there is. You probably got a sense for that in the interview. She loves Jesus. She loves the gospel. She loves the church. She loves kids and kids ministry and all that. And so it was really fun to talk with her. A few action items that I thought of coming out of that conversation are, one, to evaluate your approach through a gospel filter. So look at everything you do, not just the teaching, but even everything else, the schedule and all of that stuff, and evaluate it through a gospel filter. Maybe you'll come up with a couple ideas or things that you might want to change or tweak or adjust. Another idea is to kind of create a culture and the language for discipline with kids. What is the ideal, kind of like she talked about, thing you're going for? How would you describe it? What words could you use to paint a picture of what you're hoping for, not just a picture of what you don't want, which is probably typically how we do that. And then the third action item is to check out Revitalize, especially if your church feels like what she's talking about and there's a revitalization that's happening or needs to happen there. You want to check that out. I mean, there's nothing better than going to South Florida, you know what I mean, in April. So, and it's going to be great content from some awesome leaders. So check that out. And then, like I said in the beginning, we have open membership for Ministry Boost, and we're launching new mastermind groups. All of that is open for registration right now, but will close soon. So March 6th for membership, and then probably mid-March, maybe a week later, for the mastermind groups, or whenever they fill up, of course. So check all that out at ministryboost.org. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sharing it, for leaving a rating or review if you have done that. Appreciate that. If not, would love for you to do that. That really helps the podcast. But I hope this is going to help you this week in your ministry. You'll apply a couple of these things if you lead in kids ministry. And hope you check out ministryboost.org for those opportunities. So thanks for listening, and I'll catch you next time on the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.